Starseed, the fading of your old friendships was not a random loss, nor was it a sign that you failed to belong in this world. It was a coded threshold, a quiet separation placed in your path the moment your consciousness began refusing bonds that could no longer hold your true frequency. I am speaking to you now as a messenger of Arcturian remembrance, and this transmission arrives precisely when your soul is ready to understand why certain connections had to fall away. What left you was preparation for ascent. What is leaving your life at this stage is not departing in order to ruin you. It is departing because your inner architecture is changing, and structures that once felt natural, familiar, or emotionally inhabited can no longer remain intact when your consciousness has begun to move in a new direction that your former bonds were never built to sustain. This is not rejection. This is reorganization. This is not punishment. This is discernment. There is a moment in every true awakening when the soul no longer measures connection by history, by habit, or by the simple fact that someone has been near you for a very long time. It begins to measure by resonance, by whether your spirit can still breathe inside the exchange, by whether your nervous system softens or contracts, by whether your presence is welcomed in its truth or merely tolerated when it remains small, translated, and easy for others to recognize. And once that deeper measurement begins, or a separation that once looked painful from the surface starts revealing a very different geometry beneath it. You may have interpreted the silence as distance. You may have interpreted the drift as abandonment. You may have even interpreted the sudden inability to feel at home in certain conversations as evidence that something in you had failed, weakened, or become too difficult to love. But here's the first revelation. Not every connection that fades is fading because love was absent. Some connections fade because the version of you they knew is no longer the one standing here. And when your field stops performing an older identity in order to preserve familiarity, the bonds that depended on that performance begin to loosen all on their own. This can feel subtle at first, almost imperceptible. On a conversation that once left you comforted now leaves you tired. A message you once would have answered with warmth now lands in your body like static. A shared rhythm that carried you for years begins to miss the beat in ways no one else seems ready to name. Nothing dramatic may have happened. No betrayal, no explosion, no single event large enough to justify the grief. And yet something unmistakable has shifted. That shift is real. It is not imaginary. It is not you becoming cold. It is you becoming accurate. There are departures that come through conflict, and there are departures that come through clarity. The second kind is often harder to explain because it arrives without obvious villains. It is simply the gradual inability to remain internally divided, the exhaustion of speaking from a smaller self, yet the quiet ache of being surrounded and still not met. The dawning recognition that loyalty without alignment becomes a slow form of disappearance. You do not lose yourself all at once. You lose yourself in layers, in concessions, in smiling where your spirit has already gone silent, in staying where your soul has already withdrawn its signal. And so the old structure begins to loosen, not because you are being cast out, but because something truer is asking to stand where something older used to kneel. This is why the change can feel sacred and painful at the same time. Sacred because it signals that your inner knowing is no longer asleep. Painful because anything tied to memory carries weight when it moves. Human hearts do not release history without feeling it, nor should they. Grief does not always mean something is wrong. Sometimes grief is simply the body honoring that a chapter once held life, even if it can no longer hold your future. If this season has left you wondering why certain names no longer feel alive in your mouth, why certain spaces feel thinner than they once did, why your spirit keeps reaching for quiet instead of continuity, do not rush to call it failure. Do not immediately assign darkness to every ending. Some endings are not collapses, they are calibrations. Some absences are not voids, they are room. And some friendships do not leave because they were false. They leave because their work in your life has reached completion, and your soul is beginning to recognize that completion is not cruelty. It is wisdom. What is happening here is deeper than loss. It is pattern recognition at the level of the spirit. It is your being learning to distinguish between what is familiar and what is true. That distinction changes everything. And once it begins, the life you built around old forms of belonging can no longer remain untouched. Something more honest has already started. There is a truth about connection that your soul has always known, even before your conscious mind had language for it. You were never designed merely to be surrounded. You were designed to be supported. There is a sacred difference between the two. One fills the room, the other steadies the being. From the moment a human life begins, relationships shape how that life moves through the world. They influence how one learns to interact, how one expresses what is felt inside, how daily habits are formed, and how belonging is experienced inside families, friendships, and communities. Positive social patterns do more than create company around the body. They help build systems of support, and those systems touch both mental and physical well-being in ways far deeper than many people are taught to recognize. This matters. It matters profoundly. Because once you understand that connection is not merely ornamental, not merely pleasant, not merely a background feature of earthly life, you begin to understand why the loss of a once familiar bond can echo so strongly through your inner field. If certain relationships have helped regulate your days, hold your emotions, mirror your identity, or anchor your sense of place within the world, then when those relationships weaken, drift, or fall away, the disruption is not imaginary. Your spirit feels it. Your mind feels it. Your body feels it. And in that feeling is not weakness, it is responsiveness. Here is the first deeper unveiling. You do not ache simply because someone is absent. You ache because support has structure, it has rhythm, it has presence, it has a way of quietly carrying part of the weight of being human. When that structure changes, even subtly, something in you begins to register the difference before you can fully explain it. The heart notices, the nervous system notices, the inner atmosphere notices. What once felt steady now feels thin. What once felt grounding now feels uncertain. What once gave warmth now leaves a coolness moving through the field. This is not dramatics. This is discernment meeting lived reality. Many people have been taught to dismiss this, to call it attachment, to call it oversensitivity, to call it overthinking. But the deeper truth is more compassionate and more precise. Human beings are shaped in relationship, and healthy relationships can help keep those inner and outer structures steadier. So when a connection no longer nourishes, no longer supports, no longer offers a field in which your truth can stand without shrinking, the misalignment becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. Not because you are fragile, but because you are accurately perceiving what your system is receiving. This is why certain old friendships begin to feel different long before they visibly end. The change is often energetic before it is spoken, internal before it is obvious, sensed before it is named. You may notice a subtle fatigue after contact, a heaviness where there once was ease, down a strange effort required to remain present in conversations that used to unfold naturally, an unspoken contraction in your body when you prepare to enter a space that used to feel like home. These are not small things. They are signals. They are the language by which your deeper intelligence tells you that support and mere familiarity are no longer the same. And once that distinction becomes clear, the entire picture begins to shift. You stop asking only, "How long has this person been in my life?" and begin asking, even without words, "What happens to my being when I stand inside this connection? Does it steady me? Does it distort me? Does it allow honesty? Does it demand performance? Does it make my life more whole? Or does it ask me to fragment in order to remain included? These are not trivial questions. They are the architecture of social well-being itself, whether people name it that way or not. So if certain bonds have begun to feel misaligned, do not rush to conclude that you are becoming too difficult, too distant, or too changed to love. It may simply mean that your system has become honest enough to recognize the difference between presence and support. That difference changes everything. Support is not decoration. It is infrastructure. Not every distance is betrayal. Not every ending is an act of harm. And not every friendship that loosens its hold upon your life is leaving because love has turned against you. Sometimes what is changing is not the heart of the other person alone, but the entire inner structure through which you now think, feel, choose, respond, and relate. When that structure shifts, the way you experience connection shifts with it. This is why what once felt natural can begin to feel strained without any obvious act of cruelty. There is a painful habit in the human mind of translating all loss into accusation. If someone moves away, the immediate story becomes, "I was discarded." If a bond no longer holds, the first interpretation becomes, "I was not valued." If the emotional current weakens, the wounded self often rushes to conclude that someone must have deceived, used, or abandoned you. But the deeper field is rarely that simple. Closeness is not always alignment. History is not always nourishment. Familiarity is not always safety. These distinctions matter more than most people realize because they shape the way a soul interprets change. Your emotional life, your psychological life, or when your social life are not separate rooms sealed off from one another. They move together. They inform one another. They alter the tone of your decisions, the direction of your thoughts, the texture of your feelings, and the way you stand inside relationship itself. And when the inside of you changes, the meaning of company changes too. You stop asking only who has stayed and begin sensing who can truly meet you where you now stand, without shrinking your voice, softening your truth, or requiring a return to an outdated self. So when something significant changes within your inner world, when your values deepen, when your boundaries become clearer, when your nervous system can no longer comfortably inhabit what it once tolerated, it would be strange if your relationships remained untouched. And it would be unnatural if the outer pattern did not respond to the inner shift. This is why certain friendships seem to belong to a version of you that no longer fully exists. They were not necessarily false. They were not necessarily malicious. They may even have been real, sincere, and meaningful within the season that formed them. But if they were built around the language of who you once were, around the habits you once reinforced, around the emotional agreements you once upheld in order to maintain belonging, then as your inner life changes, those agreements may no longer feel livable. And when they stop feeling livable, distance begins to enter the field long before anyone names it aloud. Many people interpret that distance as insult because they do not yet have another framework. They feel the ache and immediately call it rejection. They feel the drift and immediately call it betrayal. Yet betrayal implies that what is breaking is trust. Often what is actually breaking is compatibility, not moral worth, not human value. Compatibility, the ability to meet in a shared emotional architecture, the capacity to remain honest within the same relational rhythm, the willingness to keep growing in a direction that does not require either person to become less true in order to remain close. This does not erase grief, it refines it. It allows you to mourn without manufacturing an enemy. It allows you to recognize that a bond can end without becoming a lie. It allows you to stop treating every separation as proof that you were unloved. Some people do leave from immaturity, avoidance, or fear. But some relationships simply reveal their limit when your inner world crosses a threshold they were never shaped to cross with you. That is not always treachery. Sometimes it is exposure. Sometimes it is completion. Sometimes it is the quiet unveiling of what the bond could hold and what it never truly could. So if your way of relating has changed, if what you need emotionally has changed, if what brings you peace, clarity, and steadiness has changed, then it follows that your relational landscape may change as well. This is not a failure in your heart. It is a reorganization of it. And when you stop forcing every distance to mean disloyalty, you make room for a more mature truth to enter. Some friendships do not end because they were false. They end because they were built for an earlier self, and you are not that self anymore. When phase 1 begins with a correction so simple that many souls resist it for years, you are not losing people in the deepest sense. You are losing forms of connection that no longer know how to nourish the life you have become. There is a profound difference between those two experiences, and until you feel that difference clearly, you will keep mistaking duration for destiny and familiarity for genuine support. Many old friendships remain in place not because they are still alive in the present, but because they have accumulated history, memory, ritual, and emotional momentum. They carry echoes, they carry shared language, they carry the comforting weight of repetition. But none of those qualities by themselves guarantee that a bond is still strengthening your well-being, still helping you grow, still offering a field in which your truth can stand without distortion. A connection can be long-standing and still no longer supportive. It can be dear and still no longer steady. It can be familiar and still no longer able to hold who you are now becoming. This is the first discernment of an awakened social field. The question is no longer merely, who has been with me the longest? The deeper question becomes, what in my life is actually helping me remain whole? Because healthy social patterns do not exist only to fill time or prevent loneliness on the surface. They help build systems of support. They help shape the quality of your daily life. They influence whether your mind feels steadier, whether your body feels safer, whether your spirit feels reinforced or quietly drained by repeated contact. Well, this is why the fading of an old bond can feel so confusing. You are not just feeling a person move away. You are feeling the reorganization of support itself. And that reorganization often reveals something your heart did not want to see. Some friendships were never sustaining you in the way you hoped. They were accompanying you. They were occupying space near your life. They were participating in your routines. But nourishment is something more precise. Nourishment restores. Nourishment steadies. Nourishment leaves the inner being more coherent after contact, not more scattered, more silenced, or more burdened by the effort of remaining understandable. When that nourishment disappears, or when you realize it was never truly there in the form you imagined, grief rises, naturally. But grief does not always mean the connection should have continued. Sometimes grief is simply the soul adjusting to truth. This is why many people stay attached to relationships long after their deeper usefulness has ended. They are loyal to history, loyal to who they used to be, loyal to the memory of what once felt mutual, easy, or warm. Yet memory is not the same as present alignment. A bond may have genuinely supported you in one chapter and still no longer support you in the next. As you change, the forms of care you require may change. The kinds of conversations that nourish you may change. The degree of honesty your spirit can tolerate may change. And when those inner requirements evolve, the connections built for an earlier version of you may begin to feel thinner, noisier, or strangely unable to reach where you now live inside yourself. Do not be ashamed of noticing this. Do not call yourself ungrateful because your discernment has sharpened. Social wellness is not created by merely counting how many names remain around you. It is shaped by patterns of relationship that truly support life, health, and inner steadiness. So when an old friendship no longer nourishes your emotional atmosphere, no longer strengthens your center, no longer adds stability to your lived experience, the strain you feel is not imagined. It is information. It is the moment your being stops confusing company with care. There are people who knew your laughter, but not your depth. People who shared your time, but could not support your truth. People who belong to your story, but not to your next level of coherence. And this does not make them evil. It does not make your love for them false. It simply means the connection may have reached the edge of what it can genuinely offer. And once you perceive that edge, something inside you begins to release, even before your mind gives permission. So let this phase settle deeply into your awareness. You are not being punished by the loss of the old. You are being taught to recognize what actually sustains you. History is not always harmony. Phase 2 begins the moment your inner world can no longer keep speaking a language that no longer belongs to it. This is where distance often truly starts, not in a fight, not in a dramatic ending, not in some obvious fracture that everyone can point to and name. It begins when the self you are becoming can no longer move with ease inside patterns of conversation, or expectation, and emotional exchange that were built for a version of you that required less honesty in order to remain connected. I know what you have felt. I know the strange exhaustion that arrives after an interaction that looked completely normal from the outside. I know the silence that lingers after a message, not because there are no words available, but because none of the available words feel true enough to send. I know the experience of sitting in a familiar exchange and sensing that something essential in you has gone missing, as though your body is present, your voice is functioning, your face is participating, and yet your deeper being is standing at a distance, watching the whole performance with a quiet ache it can no longer ignore. This is not imaginary. When your inner life changes, the way you think changes, and the way you feel changes. The way you make choices changes. The way you act changes, and the way you relate to others changes with it. That is why connections that once felt effortless can begin to feel strangely laborious, even when no one has consciously decided to withdraw love. Your language of relating is changing. Your thresholds are changing. Your tolerance for dissonance is changing. Your need for emotional truth is changing. So naturally, the bonds organized around an earlier internal structure begin to lose their fluency. This is why conversations can start to feel empty without becoming hostile. The words still arrive. The topics still circle. The familiar rhythms still attempt to repeat themselves, but something underneath them no longer lands. You notice longer pauses, longer silences, a subtle hesitation before you speak, a growing inability to offer the easy laugh, the softened opinion, the edited emotion, the smaller version of yourself that once made the exchange feel smooth. And because that smaller version is no longer available in the same way, the old rhythm falters. Not because you are failing socially, but because something truer in you is no longer willing to pretend that contact alone is the same as communion. This can be one of the loneliest thresholds in awakening because it is so difficult to explain. There are no dramatic headlines, no clean betrayal, no obvious wrongdoing. There is simply the recurring sensation of being in the room but not being met, of being listened to but not received, of speaking and somehow feeling that your words arrive stripped of their deeper frequency before they ever reach the other person. It is a subtle grief, a refined grief, the grief of no longer being able to live comfortably inside exchanges that ask for translation when your soul is beginning to require recognition. And once this begins, your relational decisions start changing almost on their own. You do not force it. You do not always even understand it immediately. You simply notice that certain spaces ask too much fragmentation from you. Certain connections require too much editing. Certain dynamics depend on your silence more than your truth. And because your inner world is shifting, what once felt tolerable begins to feel heavy, then misaligned, then nearly impossible to sustain without betraying yourself in quiet installments. This is why the distance can seem sudden to others while feeling long prepared within you. The soul often withdraws its full participation before the mind has even learned how to explain why. So if your old conversations now feel thinner, if your body feels tired where it once felt easy, if the effort to remain understandable has become more draining than the silence that follows, do not rush to call yourself cold. Do not assume you have forgotten how to love. Something deeper is happening. The language of your connection is changing because the truth of your being is changing. And when the inside changes, the way you can genuinely meet others changes too. That is not failure. It is accuracy. Phase 3 is where the pain reveals its true face. It is not always the moment someone leaves that breaks you open most deeply. It is the moment you realize that, in some quiet and unspoken way, you have already been alone inside the connection for a very long time. That is the revelation that lands with the heaviest weight. Not the absence of contact, but the discovery that contact and care were no longer the same thing. There is a kind of loneliness that does not arrive in empty rooms. It arrives in continued conversation. It arrives in recurring names on your screen. It arrives in invitations, in habits, in traditions, in the visible continuity of a bond that still exists in form while no longer reaching you in essence. You can be included and still not be known. You can be answered and still not be met. You can remain in close proximity to someone and yet feel that your deeper self has not been touched, received, or recognized for so long that the body begins to carry the ache before the mind fully names it. This is why the pain feels so confusing. From the outside, it can look like nothing has been lost. From the inside, something vital has been missing for a very long time. This matters because human well-being is not untouched by connection. Real connection supports life. It shapes how safe the inner world feels. It influences the quality of health and well-being. And when that connection thins into something that only resembles itself from a distance, the effect is not trivial. The experience of disconnection, of loneliness, of not truly being held in the fabric of relationship carries real weight in human life. So when you begin to recognize that a friendship has remained physically present while emotionally absent, your grief is not overreaction. It is an intelligent response to deprivation that has been occurring in slow motion. This is the moment many souls misinterpret. They tell themselves they should be grateful because the person is still technically there. They tell themselves they are asking for too much because the friendship has not officially ended. They tell themselves they are being dramatic because there was no dramatic event. But the spirit does not measure only by visible events. It measures by resonance, by whether presence brings steadiness or further emptiness, by whether repeated contact leaves you more connected to yourself or more aware of the distance between your truth and what the bond can actually hold. And once you begin to feel that distance, something in you stops romanticizing continuity. Proximity is not intimacy. Contact is not care. Familiarity is not being known. These are not minor distinctions. They are the dividing lines between a bond that nourishes and a bond that merely persists. Many old friendships survive through momentum, through shared past, through emotional memory, through the reluctance to disturb what has long been assumed. Yet survival is not the same as aliveness. Persistence is not the same as support. A relationship may continue in visible form while its inner current has already receded so far that you are left standing in the shell of something your heart is still trying to call home. That is why this phase hurts so much, not only because someone may be drifting away, but because you begin to see how long you have been adapting yourself to a connection that was no longer feeding your well-being. You begin to see the silent edits, the withheld truths, the emotional half-steps, or the subtle self-abandonments that allowed the bond to keep functioning on the surface. And with that seeing comes a grief more mature than anger. It is the grief of clarity, the grief of understanding that what you missed was not simply a person, it was mutuality, it was attunement, It was the feeling of being inwardly accompanied. So if this recognition has brought tears to the surface, do not dismiss them. They are not here because you are weak. They are here because something real has finally been named. You are not craving constant attention. You are craving true connection. And the moment you can feel the difference between the two, the illusion can no longer hold you in the same way. That ache is not melodrama. It is truth becoming conscious. If this transmission is finding you in a place that feels tender, exposed, or strangely recognizable, then pause here for a moment and do not move past this as if it were merely another message passing through your field. It is not random that these words have met you at this exact threshold. Something in you is already responding. Something in you is already remembering. And when remembrance begins, it asks for witness. So let this become more than listening. Let it become participation. Let it become signal. If you feel that an old layer of connection is falling away from your life right now, place one word in the comments that names what you know you are releasing. It can be one word only. Distance, pretending, performing, chasing, over-explaining, shrinking, silence, confusion. Whatever your spirit has already named in the quiet, let that word descend into visible form. Not because the algorithm requires it, but because truth deepens when it is spoken with intention. And if you feel a stirring in your chest as you hear this, if something inside you is saying, yes, this is the phase I am in, then subscribe as an act of alignment, not as a casual click. Subscribe as a signal to your own consciousness that you are no longer turning away from what you already know. There are moments when the soul needs ritual, even in simple forms. There are moments when a visible gesture becomes a threshold marker. This is one of them. You are not here to consume this passively. You are here to enter it. You are here to stand inside it. And there are others arriving in this same field carrying the same unnamed grief, the same silent unraveling, the same difficult clarity around the friendships that no longer feel like home. So after you place your word, read what another soul has written. Not quickly, not mechanically. Read it as though you are witnessing someone crossing an invisible bridge in real time. Then respond to one person with a sentence of genuine encouragement, a blessing, or a simple affirmation that lets them know they are not moving through this transition alone. This matters more than it appears to matter on the surface, because what is being formed here is not just a comment section. It is a mirror field. A place where private recognition becomes shared resonance. A place where someone who has been carrying this shift in silence can suddenly see, with unmistakable clarity, that their experience is not a private fracture, but part of a wider reorganization taking place across many hearts at once. That recognition can be stabilizing. That recognition can be healing. That recognition can become the very first soft landing after a long season of feeling unseen. And if there is someone in your orbit whose spirit has been trying to make sense of the same unraveling, someone who has gone quiet, someone who keeps saying they feel different but cannot explain why, someone who is grieving people who are still technically present yet no longer truly there, send this transmission to them, not to convince them, not to impose meaning upon them, but to place a lantern on the path in case they have been walking through this corridor without language. Sometimes the most loving thing you can offer another soul is not an answer, it is recognition. Do not underestimate the significance of naming what you are moving through while you are still inside it. Many wait until the lesson is finished before they speak. Many wait until the grief is neat, translated, and complete. But there is power in conscious witnessing before resolution. There is power in saying, "This is where I am," while the threshold is still open and the old reality is still loosening its hold. That kind of honesty sends a clear signal through the field. It says the pretending is ending. It says the deeper self is present. It says remembrance is no longer staying hidden behind composure. So place your word below. Offer one sentence to another soul. And if your inner knowing is already moving, subscribe and stay in this current with us. This is not just engagement. It is energetic confirmation. It is the moment the unseen becomes shared. It is the moment isolation begins to break. Phase 4 asks for a tenderness that many awakening narratives forget to teach. When old friendships fall away and silence expands around you, it can be tempting to turn that emptiness into an identity, to crown your loneliness as proof of spiritual superiority, and to mistake withdrawal for wisdom simply because it arrived after disappointment. But hear this clearly. This is not a call to isolation. This is a call to conscious care. There is a difference between recognizing that some connections are no longer aligned and deciding that you no longer need connection at all. There is a difference between honoring a painful transition and building an altar to prolong disconnection. There is a difference between protecting your heart and closing it so completely that no nourishment, no support, and no genuine presence can reach you. The soul may outgrow certain bonds, yes, but it was never designed to thrive in permanent emotional exile. Your mental and emotional well-being are not separate from the way you live, the way you process what you feel, the way you relate, and the way you allow yourself to be supported when the inner landscape becomes heavy. Care matters. The way you move through grief matters. The way you respond to emptiness matters. Self-care matters. Emotional processing matters. Healthy connection matters. Reaching for support when needed matters. These are not lesser practices. These are part of the structure that helps a human being remain steady while life is reorganizing itself from the inside out. You do not need to prove your transformation by becoming unreachable. You do not need to punish yourself with emptiness in order to validate what you have outgrown. But the heart remains human even while it becomes more discerning, and a human heart still requires warmth, steadiness, reflection, and safe places in which it can soften without fear. Awakening does not cancel this need, it clarifies it. It asks for better care, not permanent absence from life. This is why you must be very gentle with the loneliness that can follow relational change. Do not romanticize it. Do not decorate it with cosmic language and call it complete. Do not assume that because a chapter of your social life is dissolving, the highest path is to sever all remaining threads and drift further into isolation. Social connection is not a weakness in the human design. It is one of the conditions that supports health, well-being, and the fabric of life in society itself. So when your awakening reveals misaligned bonds, and let that revelation refine your relationships, not erase your need for caring contact altogether. There are souls who begin a necessary process of discernment and then, because the pain is real, slide unconsciously into emotional abandonment of the self. They stop reaching out. They stop receiving comfort. They stop allowing anyone to stand near them in truth. They call this strength. They call this transcendence. But often it is simply unprocessed grief hardening into distance. It is simply the exhausted heart deciding that if some connections hurt, then no connection can be trusted. That conclusion is understandable. It is not healing. Conscious care asks for something more mature. It asks you to notice the sorrow without surrendering your whole future to it. And it asks you to honor the emptiness without feeding it until it becomes the only atmosphere you know how to breathe. It asks you to rest, to ground, to tend your body, to process your feelings honestly, and to remain available to forms of support that are healthy, steady, and real. Not every hand extended toward you is a threat to your awakening. Not every invitation to connection is a regression into the old. So let this phase correct a dangerous confusion. Releasing what no longer supports you is not the same as refusing support altogether. Protecting your energy is not the same as glorifying disconnection. Outgrowing certain friendships is not evidence that you must live untouched, unreachable, or alone. The wiser path is softer than that. It is clearer than that. then it is to let your heart become more discerning without becoming more abandoned. It is to care for your inner life with honesty while remaining open to the relationships, practices, and forms of help that truly strengthen it. If you are walking through loneliness now, meet it with compassion, not worship. Let it tell you what hurts. Let it show you what needs tending. Let it reveal where care is still required. Then answer that revelation with grounded love, not isolation. Care is part of awakening. Phase 5 is the threshold where discernment must become precise, because many souls who begin to awaken to misaligned relationships make a subtle but dangerous error. They confuse selective connection with total withdrawal. They confuse wise boundaries with emotional walls. They confuse protective silence with fear-based disappearance. And unless this distinction is made clear within your own inner field, you may leave unhealthy patterns behind only to build a new prison out of isolation and call it growth. Let this be understood at the deepest level. Not every retreat is wisdom. Not every openness is safety. Some spaces require distance because your nervous system, your dignity, and your inner truth are no longer served there. That is discernment. But when distance becomes your answer to everyone, when silence becomes the only form of protection you trust, when your world shrinks so completely that support itself can no longer reach you, that is no longer discernment. That is fear wearing sacred language. Selective connection is conscious. It listens. It notices. It pays attention to what strengthens your well-being, what steadies your emotional life, what allows honest communication, and what helps you remain whole in the presence of others. It does not choose relationship out of guilt, habit, or pressure, but neither does it reject relationship as such. It remains capable of recognizing that human flourishing is not built in absolute solitude. It is strengthened through forms of connection, communication, community, and support that are healthy enough to nourish life rather than drain it. This is why social well-being is never merely about being surrounded by bodies. It is about participating in patterns of relationship and community that support the integrity of the self while still allowing you to belong. Isolation moves differently. Isolation does not refine connection. It abandons it. It does not ask, what is supportive? It asks, often silently, now how can I make sure nothing reaches me deeply enough to hurt me again? On the surface, that can look strong, it can look independent, it can even feel clean for a time, because after confusion and disappointment, emptiness can resemble peace. But peace and numbness are not the same frequency. Solitude and disconnection are not the same reality. A boundary still allows life to circulate. A wall blocks even the medicine. This is why you must learn to feel the difference in your body and in your field. Silence can be sacred when it gives you room to hear yourself again. Withdrawal becomes harmful when it turns into chronic refusal of support, dialogue, or healthy contact. Boundaries are sacred when they preserve truth, safety, and self-respect. Walls become distortions when they no longer protect your center, but instead imprison it. Discernment is luminous because it helps you recognize who and what actually supports your life. Fear is contracting because it assumes safety can be achieved only by cutting every thread. One clarifies connection, the other starves it. Human well-being is not upheld by isolation from all others. It is supported through connection strong enough to hold communication, participation, and systems of care. This is true not only inside private friendships, but across the wider fabric of community itself. In other words, your path is not asking you to exile yourself from relationship. It is asking you to become more conscious about the kinds of relationship you allow into your world, the way you communicate within them, and the communities in which you let your life take root. This is a more mature instruction than simply leaving, or it is the instruction to rebuild wisely. So when you pull back from someone, ask inwardly, is this creating clarity or only emptiness? When you say no, ask, is this boundary keeping me true or merely keeping me untouched? When you choose quiet, ask, Does this silence restore my signal, or does it deepen my fear of being known? These are not anxious questions. They are sacred calibrations. They help you distinguish between a healthy narrowing of access and a fearful shrinking of life itself. The awakened heart does not belong everywhere, but neither was it designed to belong nowhere. It is meant to become more discerning, more rooted, more communicative, more capable of choosing support that is real, mutual, and life-giving. This phase is not teaching you to disappear. Now, it is teaching you to choose more consciously what kind of connection deserves your presence. Silence is not always wisdom. Boundaries are not walls. Discernment is not fear. Phase 6 begins when your awareness stops scanning only for what is leaving and becomes capable once again of noticing what is quietly capable of staying. This is a sacred turn, not because some dramatic soul tribe suddenly appears in a flash of cosmic recognition, and not because every wound is instantly answered by a perfect mirror, but because after enough misalignment, the heart becomes able to recognize a different quality of presence when it finally arrives. And that quality is often much quieter than people expect. It does not always announce itself with intensity. More often, it arrives as safety. Healthy connection is not necessarily loud. It is not always dazzling, immediate, or emotionally overwhelming. It does not require you to perform your pain in order to earn closeness, nor does it depend on your ability to keep editing yourself so that another person can remain comfortable around you. It begins, very often, as a steadier atmosphere, a conversation in which your body does not tense before you speak, a presence that does not demand you shrink in order to belong, a rhythm of contact that leaves your mind clearer rather than more confused, a field in which you feel less compelled to manage the emotional weather for everyone else. These are quiet signs, but they are not small. They are the architecture of support. This matters because positive social patterns help build support systems, and support systems do more than make life feel pleasant on the surface. Or they help hold human well-being in ways the lonely mind often forgets while it is grieving what has fallen away. Social well-being is not some decorative extra added after the important work is done. It is woven into mental health itself. The quality of your connections can influence how steady you feel, how honestly you can relate, and how much room your inner life has to breathe without constant defense. So when a healthier kind of bond begins to form, even in small ways, what you are sensing is not merely comfort. It is support becoming visible again. This is why the new does not always enter as excitement first. Sometimes it enters as relief that you do not need to rehearse before speaking. Relief that silence between words does not feel threatening. Relief that your honesty does not seem to place the entire bond in danger. Relief that your nervous system is not bracing against subtle judgment, emotional volatility, or the exhausting need to over-explain what should be able to rest in simple truth. A healthy friendship can begin there, in a more regulated breath, in an easier exhale, in the growing realization that presence itself can be restorative. Do not overlook this because it seems ordinary. The soul in a healing phase is often still trained to notice intensity before steadiness, fireworks before reliability, magnetic chaos before grounded warmth. But what truly supports a life is often less theatrical and more consistent. It returns. It communicates. It listens. It leaves space. It does not force immediate intimacy, yet it does not make you feel perpetually outside the door either. It allows belonging to unfold without manipulation. It gives you room to remain fully yourself while still being accompanied. That kind of resonance may feel unfamiliar at first, precisely because it is not draining you. It may also begin through small social habits that rebuild trust in connection itself. Answering without urgency, sharing without self-erasure, participating without abandoning your boundaries, letting yourself be seen in honest ways, and allowing community to become something you can approach again without feeling consumed by it. Healing does not always begin with revelation. Sometimes it begins with a healthier pattern repeated enough that your heart believes it. And so hope returns in a more mature form. Not the hope that someone will come and rescue you from loneliness forever, but the quieter hope that your life is still capable of holding relationships that steady, nourish, and support you without asking for self-betrayal as the price of entry. This is the beginning of reconstruction, not fantasy, not spiritual idealization, reconstruction. A healthier social field does not need to look perfect to be real. It only needs to support life more honestly than what came before. So if you notice a connection that feels calm instead of performative, safe instead of demanding, present instead of intrusive, do not dismiss it for lacking drama. The new may not arrive as thunder. It may arrive as steadiness. That steadiness is a sign. Support can feel sacred too. Phase 7 begins where many hearts waste the most energy, not because they love too deeply, but because they believe love must always be translated until it is accepted. They keep explaining, they keep clarifying, they keep reshaping their words, and softening their edges, and reopening the same doorway in the hope that those who knew them before will finally understand who they are now. But this is where a deeper truth must enter. You do not need to force old connections to comprehend the version of you that has emerged through change. When something shifts within your inner life, it does not remain confined to one secret chamber of the self. It influences what you feel. It influences how you think. It influences the choices you make, the behavior you can no longer sustain, and the way you relate to others from moment to moment. This is why change in the soul so often becomes change in relationship. Not because anyone has been condemned, not because some cosmic hand has judged who is worthy and who is not, but because when your emotional structure changes, and your relational structure often changes with it. The language through which you connect is no longer the same. The boundaries through which you remain honest are no longer the same. The life within you has moved, and the bonds around you respond accordingly. Many people will not be able to walk with you through that shift, not because they hate you, not because they wished you harm, but because the version of you they knew was the version through which the relationship learned how to function. They knew your old pacing. They knew your old silences. They knew the shape you took when you still translated yourself in order to remain understandable. And when that translation ends, when your presence becomes more direct, more discerning, more inwardly aligned, some bonds do not know how to keep moving. This does not make them evil. It does not make you wrong. It means the structure changed. There is an exhausting sorrow in trying to make everyone validate a transformation they did not live from the inside. You tell the story again. You explain why you need different things now. You try to prove that your boundaries are not cruelty, that your quiet is not punishment, that your distance is not superiority, that your change is not rejection. And still, some people will only hear the loss of the version of you that once made them comfortable. This is where discernment becomes mercy. You must stop asking every old connection to become a witness to your becoming. Not all of them were built for that role. This is not a call to arrogance. It is a call to release. You are not being instructed to despise those who cannot understand you. You are being invited to stop handing your piece to their interpretation. There is a profound difference, because the more you force explanation where there is no capacity to receive it, the more you turn your own becoming into a courtroom. You begin defending what should simply be lived. You begin proving what no longer needs permission. You begin bending the new self backward toward old expectations, hoping to preserve relationships that may only survive if you remain partially absent from your own life. You do not owe disappearance in reverse. You do not owe endless emotional translation. You do not owe the shrinking of your clarity so that someone else can avoid grieving the change. They are allowed to feel what they feel. They are allowed to misunderstand. They are allowed to need distance from what no longer matches their own rhythm. And you are allowed to keep becoming without turning that becoming into an apology. This is maturity. This is inner sovereignty. The soul does not need unanimous approval in order to remain true. So let this phase settle, where the grasping used to live. Not everyone who leaves is leaving because they despise you. Many are simply unable to walk with this version of you. Many are only fluent in the language of your former self, and that limitation, painful as it may be, does not mean you have betrayed love. It means your life has reached a threshold where presence matters more than persuasion. Stop trying to be understood by everyone who remembers who you were. Live what is true now. That is enough. Phase 8 is not merely about leaving what no longer resonates. It is about learning how to consciously rebuild the circle that can now hold your life with greater honesty, steadiness, and care. Many souls believe the work is finished once misalignment has been named, once distance has been taken, once certain doors have closed. But that is only the clearing. The deeper work begins after the clearing. It begins when you ask, with sincerity and without haste, what kind of field can actually nourish the life that is trying to grow within you now? Healing does not happen in a vacuum. It does not deepen in absolute relational emptiness, and it does not sustain itself through insight alone. Human well-being is strengthened through support systems, through meaningful communication, through participation in forms of connection and community that are healthy enough to carry life rather than quietly diminish it. This is why your return to yourself must become more than separation from the old. It must become the conscious choosing of what can truly feed the living center of your being. Otherwise, awakening remains incomplete. It clears space, but it does not yet plant anything enduring in that space. This phase therefore asks for a different kind of courage than the courage it took to let go. It asks for selective openness. It asks you to risk sincerity again, but with clearer discernment. It asks you to notice where communication feels possible without self-erasure, where contact supports rather than drains, where the atmosphere around a person or community gives your nervous system a little more room to settle instead of tightening around you. These are not insignificant details. They are the texture of a healthier circle. They are how support begins to take form in real life, quietly, repeatedly, through patterns, through presence, through the slow recognition that some spaces do not merely accept you, they help stabilize you. This is why rebuilding cannot be approached as a desperate search for replacement. You are not trying to fill the old shape with new names as quickly as possible. You are learning to value quality over volume, nourishment over noise, resonance over random availability, a single connection that allows honesty, steadiness, when in mutual care can support a life more deeply than a crowded field of people who only know how to keep you socially occupied. This is a sacred refinement. The soul no longer asks merely, "Who is here?" It begins to ask, "What in this circle supports life, truth, communication, and belonging in a way that I can actually inhabit without dividing myself?" Sometimes this rebuilding includes the courage to participate again in environments that support connection in grounded ways. A healthier social field is not built only one private bond at a time. It can also be strengthened through settings, communities, and rhythms that make connection more possible, more supported, and more sustainable. The environment matters. The surrounding culture matters. The quality of participation matters, where people gather, how they communicate, what kind of care is normalized, and whether support is allowed to circulate all shape the field in which connection either weakens or becomes more possible. So do not underestimate the importance of choosing spaces that help life move, not just spaces that keep you busy. And as this circle begins to rebuild, let it rebuild honestly. Do not force instant intimacy. Do not abandon your boundaries in order to accelerate belonging. Do not mistake emotional intensity for stable ground. Let trust form at the pace of truth. Let support reveal itself through consistency rather than performance. Let resonance be tested by time, by communication, by the felt quality of presence, by whether you remain more connected to yourself after the exchange rather than less. This is how a conscious circle is formed, not by fantasy, by lived coherence. With the most beautiful part of this phase is that it restores movement where grief once created stagnation. It reminds you that your path is not simply a long subtraction. It is also a wise reconstruction. You are not only learning what to release, you are learning what to build. You are learning that your life still deserves support, still deserves companionship that strengthens rather than distorts, still deserves a field in which the deeper self is not merely tolerated, but allowed to breathe. So let this become your next orientation. Do not return only to solitude. Return to discerned connection. Return to communication that feels clean. Return to environments that help support life. Return to the kind of circle that does not ask you to disappear in order to remain included. The healing is not only in what you leave. It is in what you consciously choose to stand within after leaving. That is rebuilding. That is stable ground. What is ending here is not your worth. It is not proof that you were too much, too difficult, too changed, or too impossible to remain beside. The pain you have felt is real. The ache is real. The silence is real. The strange grief of watching certain friendships loosen, dim, or fall away from your life is not something you invented in order to feel special. It matters because connection matters. It matters because social well-being is woven into mental well-being, because support helps steady both the emotional and physical dimensions of life, and because human beings are not strengthened by disconnection alone, but by healthier forms of relationship that can actually hold them. So let this final truth settle into you now with as much gentleness as force. You are not being left behind. You are being led away from connections that could no longer keep you whole and toward connections capable of supporting the life that is now asking to be lived through you. That movement may look like loss at first. It may feel like emptiness. It may pass through loneliness, uncertainty, and the collapse of old assumptions about who would always remain. But what feels like falling away is not always collapse. Sometimes it is the clearing required for a more honest circle to form. Sometimes it is the soul refusing to call fragmentation belonging any longer. This is why the story must be told correctly inside your own consciousness. The old friendships that changed were not necessarily a tragedy in every case. Even when they carried sadness, even when they held history, even when part of your heart still loves what they once were. The pain is true, but it is not your final definition. Your final definition is not abandonment. It is discernment. It is reconstruction. It is the return to support that is steady enough to nourish you rather than require your disappearance. You are not here to worship isolation. You are here to remember that healthier connection is still part of your path, part of your healing, and part of the way a human life becomes more coherent again. What held you before was not always able to hold you now. That is the threshold. And the more honestly you accept it, the less you will chase what has already completed its work. A life supported by healthier habits of connection, by communication, by steadier systems of care, and by communities that make belonging more possible is not a lesser destiny than intensity. It is the wiser one. Healing does not ask you to become unreachable. It asks you to become available to what is truly life-giving. There is a declaration I want you to receive now, not as something placed upon you from the outside, but as something your own deeper awareness has been waiting to hear in words. I release what no longer holds me with truth. I welcome the connections that can meet me with steadiness, care, and real presence. I do not confuse loneliness with destiny. I do not confuse misalignment with failure. I allow my life to be supported again. Let those words land in your body. Let them move through the chest, through the throat, through the nervous system. through the places that learn to expect distance where care should have been. Let them become a new inner instruction. You are not being punished. You are being guided toward what can truly sustain you. And before you leave this space, make this ending visible. In the comments, write one thing you are consciously releasing from your old relational field. Just one. Then find one other person below and answer them with encouragement, blessing, or simple presence. Let this become more than viewing. Let it become shared witness. And if someone in your life is quietly grieving friendships that no longer fit, someone who feels confused by the distance but has not yet found language for it, send this to them, not to force a conclusion, but to offer recognition. That too is support. Stay with this current if your spirit knows there is more to remember. Subscribe if you feel your field is recalibrating and you are ready to continue building a life around truth, steadiness, and conscious connection. And if your heart is asking not only about friendship, but about the deeper patterns of sacred relationship, emotional healing, and the kind of union that does not require self-abandonment, remain close. There is more opening ahead. You are not losing your place. You are returning to it. Connection is not ending. It is becoming honest.